think we should get started with art viewing adventures. We are back, and we've got Bernice Iwamoto coming back. This is I don't know. I think you're the person who's been the most times as a guest on this show.
That or I'm tied. Last time I remember, I was tied with Charlie. I thought, doggone it, if I'd only get one more.
So, well, we're really happy to have you back, and you've got an exciting program today, and kind of fun for me because I haven't even been through it. So it's going to be a little bit of a surprise for me and for everybody. Before we get started with the program, though, Nikki, I think you should officially welcome us through the Community Living Campaign, who's hosting us.
Okay, on behalf of the Community Living Campaign, hello everybody. Here again, one of my favorite programs that we have with the Community Living Campaign. We're a nonprofit in San Francisco. We support seniors and people with disabilities with a lot of programming such as tech support. We're very much involved with shrinking the digital divide between seniors and disabled people and being able to have technology not at our fingertips, but at our fingertips and able to use it. So if people need any support like that, please look into our organization. I'll put our website link up on our chat. And we have tonight one of our more popular programs that's been around for even before the COVID is Boomer Music. And tonight he's featuring Dusty Springfield. So that should be really fun. Let's see, this week we have on Thursday, we have talk about all about emergency preparedness. And I think I saw another popular program. It's the one about self-defense for seniors. And that's with Janet G, the lady who teaches at City College. She's pretty well known in the community. Oh, that's next Wednesday at 3. But if you want to take a look at our calendar, it's online. We'd send them out in paper as well if somebody wants to get it delivered. So I'll put my information in the chat if you want to send me your mailing address. Okay. I don't want to take up too much time because this sounds like it's going to be a nice program. So thanks for showing up, everybody.
It's going to be a great program. Thank you, Nikki. I also want to say thank you to Jennifer, who is our technical moderator from Community Living Campaign. She always does a great job. But yes, Bernice, very happy to have you back on Art Viewing Adventures. And you, like me, are a guide with a museum that we tend not to say their name because they're a little shy, but it's a museum with newer art in downtown San Francisco. A lot of the art is untitled, so we call it the San Francisco Unnamed Museum of Art, or SF-UMA. And you're also a guide, or actually a docent, with the Oakland, what do we call it? Oakland, California Museum?
Oakland Museum of California.
Oakland Museum of California.
All the words.
But Bernice, go ahead, take us on this adventure with the story behind some of the art we may know.
Absolutely. Let me go back here. So, you may have wondered what happened to the people after the portrait was painted or the photograph was snapped. So today we're going to answer some of those questions about some really, really famous works of art. My title, it comes from the radio show called The Rest of the Story. And that radio show consisted of having a backstory to people, things, and events, both famous and not so known. The broadcast always concluded with a variation on the tagline, and now you know the rest of the story. So let's start with this universal icon of Western painting. This particular work, The Birth of Venus by Botticelli. And if you could name one woman during the Renaissance that could have been called Italy's top model, it would have been Simonetta Vespucci. And she was nicknamed La Bella. Now, Simonetta, she was an Italian noblewoman from Genoa, and she was the wife of Marco Vespucci of Florence and his cousin, and the cousin-in-law to Amerigo Vespucci. He was the one who came up with the idea that what Columbus had found was not Asia, but in fact, America. And Simonetta, as you can see here, she was beautiful. And she was, and famous Renaissance artists, they painted her a lot, as you can see. Now, Simonetta and Marco were married in Florence, and she became instantly popular in Florence, in the court there. She was discovered by Botticelli and other prominent painters, And legend says that every nobleman in the city was besotted with her, including the brothers Lorenzo and Giuliano of the ruling Medici family. Now, Lorenzo was the de facto ruler of Florence, the Florentine Republic, and was the most powerful and enthusiastic patron of Renaissance culture in the city. Unfortunately, the glorious life of Simonetta Vespucci, it ended quickly. She died, presumably of tuberculosis, in 1476. She was barely 22 at the time. Now, Botticelli, he finished this work, Birth of Venus, in 1485, which was 9 years after Simonetta's death. And some people have claimed that the Venus in the painting closely resembles Simonetta. Some art historians say that is romantic nonsense. To be honest, there's no evidence that the Venus has Simonetta's face, but why wouldn't she? On the other hand, another art historian suggests that Botticelli had actually fallen in love with her, and he requested to be buried at her feet in the church of Ognissanti, which is the parish church of the Vespuccis. And his wish was actually carried out when he died some 34 years later in 1510. Now, Botticelli, I will tell you, he never wed, and he actually expressed a strong dislike to the idea of marriage. The prospect, he claimed, gave him nightmares. But the story of La Bella Simonetta, the great muse of the great artist of the most and the most beautiful woman of the Renaissance, those all remain. Now, sticking with our Italian artists, we're going to look next at another Italian Renaissance painter, Leonardo da Vinci. Now, of course, if I'm going to talk about famous models in Da Vinci, of course we have to look at Mona Lisa. Now, there's been a lot of speculation and debate regarding the identity of the portrait sitter. Scholars and historians have posited numerous interpretations, including that she was Lisa del Giocondo, the wife of the Florentine merchant Francesco di Bartolomeo del Giocondo. Hence, the alternative title for this work, La Gioconda. Now, Lisa was born in Florence in 1479, and she was the oldest of 7 children. And at the age of 15, she was married to Francesco del Giocondo, who was a cloth and silk merchant. And after some business success in 1503, her husband was able to buy a house next door to his family's old home. And it's believed that it was then that her portrait was commissioned by her husband, perhaps to celebrate their new house or maybe to mark her second pregnancy. Now, during the painting of Lisa, Da Vinci's handwritten notes make reference to her cheerful personality and her engaging laughter. Interesting fact, in 1506, Leonardo considered this portrait unfinished. He was never paid for the work and he never delivered it to the client. This particular painting traveled with him throughout his life, and he most likely completed it years later in France. And it was in his studio when he died in 1519. And he most likely worked on it intermittently over several years, adding multiple layers of thin oil glazes at different times. There's small cracks in the paint called craquelure, and those appear throughout the whole piece, but they are finer on the hands where the thinner glazes correspond to Leonardo's late period. Now let's look at another great masterpiece of Western art, also by Leonardo da Vinci. This particular work, Lady with an Ermine, and that introduces us to Cecilia Gallerini. Now, Cecilia, she was young, beautiful, and talented, especially in the areas of art and literature. And she entered the court of Milan and wrote poetry. Now, Cecilia, she was the mistress of Ludovico Sforza, who was the Duke of Milan, and he was also known as Il Moro, the Moor. He's actually also the person who commissioned Da Vinci to paint The Last Supper. Now, according to legend, Duke Ludovico postponed his marriage more than once, allegedly because he was in love with Cecilia. He was engaged to marry Beatrice to Este when she was only 5. Now, they waited and didn't marry until she was 15, until she was 16. Now, Beatrice was reputed to be one of the most beautiful and accomplished princesses of the Italian Renaissance. Now, both their families had been on friendly terms, and to cement the alliance, Duke Ludovico asked Beatrice's father to give him a daughter's hand in marriage, his daughter Isabel, Beatrice's older sister. But Isabel was already promised to Francesco Gonzaga, so Papa offered him Beatrice instead. Now, Duke Ludovico, he had to fulfill his political responsibilities, so he married Beatrice in January of 1491, and it was actually a double wedding. Duke Ludovico married Beatrice, and her brother Alfonso married Anna Sforza, Ludovico's niece. And Leonardo Da Vinci, he orchestrated the wedding celebration. Now, Cecilia, she continued to keep her apartments in Duke Ludovico's castle, and in May of that year, she gave birth to his son, Caesar. Well, of course, his wife Beatrice learned that Duke Ludovico had still been seeing Cecilia, so he had to ask Cecilia to leave the court. And richly endowed, she was married off to actually another man by the name of Ludovico, but this one was a count, Count Bergamini. And it's believed that when she left, she took a portrait with her. Now, I will say, Duke Ludovico, his string of power plays and amorous pursuits, those were cut short. After bearing him two sons, his wife Beatrice, she died in childbirth at the age of 21. The Duke himself was later overcome by the forces of Louis XII when they invaded Milan, and he died as a prisoner to the French king. Cecilia's story, however, has a much happier ending. She presided over one of the most celebrated courts in northern Italy, drawing artists, writers, nobles, and politicians from across Europe. Cecilia Gallerini became an esteemed author, musician, and patron of the arts. And she lived to an old age and even befriended Beatrice's older sister, Isabel, who was one of the most influential women during the Italian Renaissance. Now, in 2014, the French scientist Pascal Cotte revealed that the artist actually painted one portrait without the ermine and two with different versions of the fur. Now, it had been thought that the 500-year-old painting had always included that ceremonial animal. An ermine's coat turns brown during the summer, but its winter coat is pure white, with the tip of the tail being black. And for centuries, that fur was the exclusive fur of royal robes of majesty, because it was supposed to represent moral purity. Now, the Duke, of course, was Leonardo's main patron during his 18 years in the city, and he was nicknamed the White Ermine. So could the ermine have been a reference to Duke Ludovico's membership in the Order of the Ermine, with its motto, death before dishonor? The ermine also could have been a play on Cecilia's surname, which sounds similar to the Greek word for ermine. Or did Leonardo place that animal in the portrait to hide her pregnancy? That the pure white ermine itself symbolized restraint, purity, or even chastity. So, could Leonardo have placed the animal in the arms of Cecilia to remind viewers that she was Duke Ludovico's mistress? That itself, so the reason for the ermine, it's a bit of a mystery. I will tell you, this painting, it passed through Cecilia's heirs until it landed in the collection of the Czartoryskis. Doesn't every good Polish son buy his mother Da Vinci when he's on the grand tour? Well, Adam Czartoryski, I know, I see some people nodding, of course, right? Well, Adam Czartoryski, he was a good son. And his mother, Isabella, she was a passionate collector and the foundress of the Czartoryski Museum. She appreciated her present. Now, even although the circumstances of the sale are vague, we really only know that the Czartoryskis were sure that that Adam had acquired a work by Leonardo da Vinci. Now, the family, they very carefully protected the painting, and they moved it and hid it during the instability of the Russian threats in the 19th century, and then again during World War I. But in 1939, the story of Cecilia's portrait took a dramatic and dangerous turn. Hans Frank, who ultimately became the Nazi governor of Poland, he set that portrait in his sights upon the German invasion of Poland in the autumn of 1939. And by the end of World War II, the Nazis had either stolen or tried to steal every known painting by Leonardo da Vinci, and the lady with the ermine was at the top of their list. After Nazi soldiers located the picture hidden inside a walled-up compartment in one of the Czartoryski family's country estates, the portrait soon became a pawn in an epic power struggle among several high-ranking Nazi officers. And between 1939 and 1945, the lady traveled back and forth multiple times between Poland and Germany. It's a wonder it survived at all. In 1939, after the Nazi invasion of Poland, an SS soldier's footprint was found on the painting. When the Allies located Hans Frank in his Bavarian lakeside villa in May of 1945, this particular painting, Da Vinci's Lady with the Ermine, was among a handful of the remaining masterpieces in his personal possession. And during the Nuremberg trial, Frank pled that he had done everything in his power to safeguard the art treasure. Now, the lady is safe at the National Museum in Krakow. And yes, those are the monuments men. Although there's no George Clooney, sadly, in that photo. But these are the real monuments men. All right, now we've had a chance to look at 3 works by Italian artists who painted women of means. Let's leave Italy and talk about a French artist, Henri Toulouse-Lautrec, who painted a much different woman. This is dancer Jane Avril, who was a star of the Moulin Rouge, and she became Henri Toulouse-Lautrec's greatest muse. She frequently appeared on his dazzling posters, and the can-can performer also provided the image for the ubiquitous red-haired woman celebrated in his paintings. Avril, she was an unconventional beauty, and she often appeared quite nervous or melancholic. She suffered from a movement disorder called Sydenham chorea, known as St. Vitus's dance, and she spent time in the hospital. As a result, however, her contorted physical style made her a dynamic model and a celebrated attraction. And Henri Toulouse-Lautrec helped elevate her to the status of cabaret icon in his 1893 poster of her. You can see, right? Very similar, right? We have her, we can see her, and the photo of her and the poster of her. Now, in contrast to Toulouse-Lautrec, who was a member of one of France's oldest noble families, Jane Avril was the daughter of a courtesan. She was born Jeannie Boudon, and she suffered an abusive childhood, and at the age of 13, she ran away from home. The following year, she entered the hospital where she was treated for St. Vitus's dance. Now, it was there at one of their fancy dress balls that the hospital would organize for the patients. It was there that she took her first dance steps, and she found both her cure and her vocation. At the age of 20, she was taken on by the Moulin Rouge as a professional dancer, and she adopted the stage name Jane Avril. It was suggested to her by an English lover. And she was determined to make her mark as a star in the flourishing world of the dance halls and the cabarets. Now, although she also sang, really Jane's true vocation was as a solo dancer, and she devised her own choreographic routines and dances. Despite her rather fragile and ethereal look on stage, she proved to be a pretty acrobatic dancer full of energy and grace, and she was even regarded by her contemporaries as the incarnation of dance. Now, Toulouse-Lautrec's relationship with Jane Avril was closer than with many of his other subjects, and she remained his loyal friend until his death. There, you can see here, their friendship is reflected in a series of portraits of Jane as a more private individual, in contrast to that pretty exotic poster. The one at Cortland's Gallery, where we see Jane Avril at the entrance to the Moulin Rouge, it sort of captures her between sort of the public and her private world. You see there's a carriage that we see in the background, and a hat and a coat on the wall that may allude to, it could allude to some male admirers. But she does seem a little witch on, honestly, and a little bit older than her 22 years. In Jane Avril Leaving the Moulin Rouge, she's shown as a passerby, quite elegant, but somewhat anonymous. Now that we've had this opportunity, I will say, let me show you this. Toulouse-Lautrec's death in 1901, it marked the end of the golden age of Montmartre, and Jane Avril went on to perform briefly as a stage actress before she married and settled into obscurity. Now, we've seen these artists paint mostly glamorous women. Our next model is painted very, very differently. Now, many of you are familiar with this particular work by Whistler. It's a portrait of his mother, officially titled Arrangement in Gray and Black, #1. Now, given the picture's iconic status as a symbol of motherhood, you may believe that you might be able to guess his mother's character, her personality, and her life experiences were probably something like a quiet, seemingly frail little woman sitting in that chair. You might think she led a rather isolated or sheltered life, or maybe spent her days baking cookies. She may have been a quiet, diminutive woman, but she was a mighty force in the lives of those around her. She reared a renowned artist, an acclaimed physician, a prosperous businessman, and a daughter who married into the English upper crust. Now, Anna Whistler was defined to a large extent by her times, and she did assume many of the societal roles prescribed for 19th century middle-class American women. The ideas that women should strive for piety, purity, domesticity, and submissiveness. Well, Anna spent the first few years of her life in North Carolina, where she was raised by her physician father and a beautiful, cultured mother. Both her plantation-owning uncle and Anna's brother had children with Black women. And in the case of her uncle, Zephaniah Kingsley Jr., that led to a widely publicized legal battle in which family members, including Anna, challenged the terms of his will. He had bequeathed the larger part of his enormous wealth to his Senegalese-born wife. Now, Kingsley stipulated that no remaining slaves should be separated from their families and that they should be given the opportunity to purchase their freedom at half their market price. Well, let me tell you, Anna was not the only formidable woman in this family. Anna Whistler's uncle's widow, Anna Chai, she kept her African name throughout their marriage. She returned to Florida to oppose the Kingsleys, to oppose Kingsley's white relatives in the courts. And the court upheld the will. And his widow, she got to keep her money, which, when you think about it, that's a pretty extraordinary achievement in light of the state and local policies that was hostile towards freed slaves or Blacks of any status. So, getting back to Anna Whistler's mother, her education was very firmly grounded in the teachings of the Episcopal Church. And in 1931, she married widower George Washington Whistler, and she inherited three stepchildren. Whistler's father, George, had attended the U.S. Military Academy, West Point, and he was a construction engineer for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company. Now, 13 years into their marriage, Anna packed up her family and moved to St. Petersburg, Russia. Her world-renowned engineer husband had been hired by Tsar Nicholas I to build a railroad from St. Petersburg to Moscow. And George, Whistler's father, was actually a very prominent railroad engineer. Stone arch railroad bridges that he helped build in 1841. There's still in freight and passenger service in Western Massachusetts. He also invented a system of communication between the locomotive engineer and the train crew, known as Whistler's trumpet. And while he was in Russia, he served as a consultant on the building of Russia's first major railroad, the Moscow to St. Petersburg Railway. He's also credited with selecting the 5-foot rail gauge that's still used in Russia and neighboring countries. Now, when Anna's husband died of cholera, she had to return to America and rear her 2 remaining adolescent children all on her own. Now, from a position of relative wealth and status in Russia, she found herself almost impoverished without her husband's income, and she was forced to depend on her modest savings. But as you can imagine, Anna was not without her connections and influence. When young James was a cadet at West Point, Anna coaxed then Superintendent Robert E. Lee to give her cadet son James a weekend pass. She later put her son William through medical school, and she acted as the unofficial business manager in America for James, who, upon being dismissed from West Point, had gone to Paris and London to become an artist. And Anna promoted his work and sought commissions and acted as his advisor. All right, now that we've seen one Southern-born American who was born across the pond to support her family, let's look next at another Southern-born American who went across the pond to seek her fortune. She was born Virginie Avigno, and she was the daughter of white Creole parents in New Orleans. Her father died fighting for the Confederacy at the Battle of Shiloh, and her younger brother died as well. Her widowed mother, she'd had enough. So she took out some loans on the family plantation, and she and her daughter left for Paris. And it was there that Virginie married big time to a Parisian banker who was more than twice her age, Pierre Gutro. And when Virginie, she presented herself to French society, both in Paris and in their country home, people would gather to witness her beauty. Her renown made the papers throughout France, England, and the United States, from Maine to California. She was beguiling, not conventionally pretty, but nevertheless, she cut a striking figure with her thin lips and extreme pallor. And according to one Sargent biographer, she not only covered herself with powder, but she also consumed arsenic to sap her skin of color. Now, although she had many public admirers and a packet of money, she still struggled to climb to the top of the Parisian society. The gossip pages only took a limited notice of her, and as a Creole, she would have been excluded from the highest echelons of the French beau monde. So she and her ambitious mother were keen to make her a name. And the young John Singer Sargent, who had commissions from fellow expats, he craved French acceptance. And he was keen to make his own name as well. So there they were, an American socialite and an American painter, both in their late 20s, both eager for their big break. It took 30 sessions, and as he would throughout his career, Sargent chose the dress. This little black number, which might actually have been a two-piece skirt and bodice drawn in at the waist with that pretty severe décolletage. Now, the original, I will tell you, was painted with a bare shoulder. That bare shoulder plus the wedding ring on her left hand made for a scandalous combination. It signified, not very subtly, that this married woman would look kindly upon introductions from other men. The Salon of 1884 marked the 6th time that Sargent had exhibited in France's most important art exhibition, and he knew that the portrait of Madame Gutro was a risk, but he had never received such bad reviews. Critics compared her skin tones to those of a corpse. Newspapers published cartoons and satirical poetry mocking both the artist and the model. The New York Times critic, yes, back then the New York Times did send their critics to Paris. The critic said that Sargent is below his usual standard this year. His portrait of the so-called beauty, Madame Gutro, is character. The pose of the figure is absurd and her bluish coloring atrocious. Well, her mother, needless to say, Madame Gutro's mother, she wailed to Sargent, "My daughter is lost." She and Virginie and her mother, they both tried to have the painting pulled from the salon, to no avail. Of course, nudes had been everywhere in the salons. However, with Madame Gutro's approval, this time they had dared to showcase the confident, even predatory sex appeal of a high society woman, and a married one at that. The little black dress made things worse, not better. And there was a further problem. Thanks to all the public scandal, Sargent suddenly realized that Madame Gutro's family were in no mood to buy the painting. The portrait had been done on commission, had not been done on commission, excuse me. After all, he painted it on spec. So he had bet that the notoriety of the salon display would win him a high price and further commissions. Obviously, he'd bet wrong. So Sargent, he bailed for London, and he never again painted anything quite so daring. Madame Gutro, she stayed in France and tried to re-enter society, but where once she could count on high-ranking politicians or titans of finance to accompany her to the opera, she was now stuck with middling functionaries as escorts. She commissioned 2 other portraits of herself. Both of them ended up in the salon, but neither of them really had any impact. And as she grew older, she lived separately from her husband, and she sort of drifted out of the historical records, and the details become pretty sketchy. Now, one biographer suggests, somewhat romantically, that in her later years, she took all the mirrors down from her walls and she would only go outside at night. Now, Sargent held on to the portrait until 1916, a year after Madame Gutro's death, and he sold it to the Met. And he wrote one of the museum's curators, "I should prefer, on account of the row I had with the lady years ago, that the picture should not be called by her name. Hence, Madame X, a woman unknown, perhaps unknowable." Her name got scrubbed out, but as you can see, her image has endured. Now, we've met a scandalous woman who didn't fare so well from her painting. Let's look next at one who fared a bit better. Now, this statue is the memorial statue here in San Francisco, and it's located in the center of Union Square. I'd like to introduce you to Alma de Bretteville. Now, after taking some classes at the Mark Hopkins Institute of Art, today's San Francisco Art Institute, Alma found that she found herself, thanks to her imposing presence and statuesque figure, she was 6 feet tall, she was inundated with requests to pose for artists. Her willingness to pose nude made her popular, financially comfortable, and totally infamous. And in 1902, Alma de Bretteville succumbed to the wooing efforts of a successful miner named Charlie Anderson. Anderson was a keen businessman, and he had the gifts to prove it. But he also had a flair for the dramatic. He said he fell in love with her at first sight and bought her fur coats, pearls, diamond jewelry, and other accoutrements, all while promising to marry her when he got back from a work trip in the Klondike. But when he returned, the relationship cooled. He ghosted. So she took him to court. And because in the words of Beyonce, because if you liked it, then you should have put a ring on it. Well, Alma sued her former beau for $50,000 for breach of contract for failing to marry her. She'd later tell friends that she sued him for personal defloweration. Now, the judge, he sided with Alma, and he ordered Charles Anderson to pay her a respectable $1,250. Now, being hired to be the model for the Dewey Monument, it wasn't just monumental because it would display her likeness in the heart of San Francisco forever, but it was also the reason she met her husband. Soon after posing for this goddess of victory statue, Alma, 6 feet tall and boisterous, caught the eye of Adolf Spreckels. Now, Adolf Spreckels, he was loaded. He was the son of the sugar refinery entrepreneur Klaus Spreckels and heir to the sizable Spreckels Sugar Company fortune. Although Spreckels owned railroads, shipping companies, and real estate, they were best known as sugar tycoons. He was on the Citizens Committee responsible for funding the Dewey Monument. The monument, the moment he saw the model in the statue, he was smitten with Alma. Now, Adolf Spreckels, who was 2 decades Alma's senior, he himself had a reputation for pursuing much younger women. He honestly had a notorious history. He had attempted to assassinate Mike DeYoung, who was the editor-in-chief of the San Francisco Chronicle. Allegedly, Adolf was upset that the Chronicle accused Spreckels' businesses of being a monopoly, which they were. DeYoung survived by deflecting the bullet with a package of books, proving that books are actually the best weapons. And Adolf, to the surprise of everyone in the city, he got off scot-free. With Spreckels and DeYoung's respective fortunes, this was sort of the equivalent of the O.J. Simpson trial of its time. Now, Spreckels' colorful history was fine with Alma. She used to say, "I'd rather be an old man's darling than a young man's slave." And she would call Adolf her sugar daddy. And they would go on to marry 5 years after a pretty secretive relationship began. And yes, she did help coin that phrase, sugar daddy. And while she was on vacation in Paris, she met Auguste Rodin, the French sculptor best known for The Thinker and The Gates of Hell. And it was then that she purchased 13 works of art. And she convinced her husband to establish a permanent art museum inspired by the French Palace of the Legion of Honor. And by the time she passed away, she was known as the great grandmother of San Francisco, not only for her philanthropic work based upon the Legion of Honor, but she also supported the San Francisco League of Servicemen and the Maryhill Museum of Art and San Francisco's Maritime Museum. All right, so far, all these sitters we've looked at, they're pretty glamorous. These next two sitters were famous for being portrayed in a completely opposite way. Oh, wrong way, sorry. Now, there are very few paintings as iconic as Grant Wood's American Gothic. Grant Wood painted American Gothic as the United States was entering the Great Depression. And Grant Wood wanted to show models that captured the essence of hardworking Middle America. Now, the first hardworking model is the house in Eldon, Iowa. And it was built in 1881 by Catherine and Charles Dibble. Now, those windows, they're not just pretty, they were practical. Wood may have found them a little pretentious, but the windows, there was one in the front of the house and one in the back. Those were hinged to allow the family to more easily move furniture in and out, uninhibited by the narrow staircase inside. And as extraordinary as it may seem, in a house instead of in a larger structure like a church, it's believed that those distinctive windows were actually purchased from a Sears and Roebuck catalog, right? It's amazing what you could have bought back in the Sears and Roebuck catalog back in the day, right? You've got these windows, and 2 weeks ago, Avril, she introduced us to those ceramic tiles that are all over Wichita, Kansas. Now, as for the people models, Grant Wood painted the family dentist, Dr. Byron McKeeby. He, of course, modeled for the older man, and Grant Wood's younger sister, Nan, for the younger woman. The two reluctantly posed for the painting after Wood assured them that they would not be recognized. The models never stood in front of the house and actually sat separately for the painting. And this painting, of course, has become one of the most famous images in the world, and certainly one of the most parodied. Now, Grant Wood, his first choice for the female model was actually his mother, Hattie, but he was concerned that posing at length would be too much for her. So instead, Nan sat in. But Mother Hattie, she did contribute. She lent her apron and her cameo for her daughter's costume. Now, when Grant Wood posed his sister, Nan is the female half, they could not have foreseen how deeply her likeness would resonate. Her rendering as a plain, stern-faced Iowa woman had a timeless, enigmatic quality that led some viewers to call her America's Mona Lisa. For the painting, Wood elongated Nan's features and gave her a look of severity. She was 29 when the painting was done, much younger than Dr. McKeeby, and she was often referred to as his wife rather than his daughter, which embarrassed her. But Nan wasn't the only one who didn't find her likeness complimentary. When the newspaper in Grant Wood's hometown of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, first presented the image of American Gothic, the painting sparked a backlash. The dour portrait was not how the locals saw themselves, and they resented being presented this way to the world. One farm wife was so enraged by the painting that she threatened to bite Wood's ear off. Another suggested that he have his head bashed in. Wood was stunned by the acrimony, insisting that he was a loyal Iowan. He meant no offense, only an homage. Now, his biographer, R. Tripp Evans, wrote, when American Gothic was first shown in 1930, There were critics who said she looked like the missing link, that her face would turn milk sour. The following year, as a sort of apology, Grant painted Portrait of Nan, one of his most intriguing works. It's kind of a love letter from Grant to his sister, says Evans. He adored his sister Nan, and it's a painting that he felt very close to as well. And it's one of the few from his mature period that he kept for himself. You can see a portrait of Nan's, you can see a picture of Nan's portrait above the mantle in his home. Now, Nan's role as Grant's muse ended with this Portrait of Nan. Evans writes in the biography, after completing the painting, Wood reportedly told his sister, "This is the last portrait I intend to paint, and it's the last time you will ever pose for me." She was surprised. She'd spent years posing for him and asked for an explanation. Wood said, "Your face is too well known." Now, Dr. Byron McKeeby, he didn't want to be famous. He shied away from artist Grant Wood's initial offer to be the male model for American Gothic. Wood said he'd exaggerate McKeeby's features so no one would recognize him. The two were friends, so McKeeby relented. Now, McKeeby distanced himself from the painting when it took the country by storm. Friends thought it was him and even joked about the pitchfork's role in his dental procedures. But McKeeby stood firm in his denials. He was known for his dapper style and his affable sense of humor. The real McKeeby was nothing like the dour farmer who challenged the painting's viewers. It was literally national news when McKeeby broke his silence in 1935 and admitted that, yes, he was the farmer with the pitchfork. Cy Douglas, an Associated Press news bureau chief, had helped prod the turnaround. He was close to the dentist's oldest son, Gerald McKeeby, who had actually married Douglas's sister. And McKeeby eventually embraced his role in the painting, appreciating the undying debates and the fact that he looked more like the embattled farmer as he got older. Now, fun fact about this particular work, Wood's signature is actually hidden. If you look at the bottom right-hand corner of the farmer's overalls, you'll see the artist's name painted along with the canvas medium, which is wood, and the year, 1930, in pale blue. And it's almost illegible against the denim backdrop. Now, for this last work, I want to share for you a photo of what actually helped inspire this presentation. Now, in March of 1942, the War Relocation Authority hired Dorothea Lange to document the evacuation and internment of the Japanese Americans living in Northern California. Ultimately, some 120,000 people, 80,000 of whom were US citizens, were rounded up and imprisoned. Dorothea Lange was opposed to the program and its underlying racism. As she said, what was, of course, horrifying was to do this completely on the basis of what blood may be coursing through a person's veins, nothing else. Nothing to do with your affiliations or friendships or associations, just blood. Now, so Dorothea Lange, what she would do was she would photograph families, ordinary working people before the removal began, and she tried to demonstrate, their Americanness, their citizenship, their work ethic, their respectability, all the things that all Americans do. Now, this particular portrait, this particular photo that she took at the Nisei Grill, it was a local hangout in Japantown in San Francisco, and it was open 24 hours. The favorite dish was a cut steak special, which was a flank steak cut thin and fried with onions and soy sauce over rice. And the restaurant was located at 1715 Post, which is now the steps leading up to the Peace Pagoda. Part of the restaurant sign has actually been replicated as part of the history gallery at the Oka Museum of California. Now, when Dorothea Lange died in 1995, her husband, Paul, gifted to the museum her collection of over 25,000 negatives, 6,000 prints, papers, and field notes, as well as the correspondence. Now, these are some photos of the family who actually owned the Nisei Grill. These are photos of the Nonaka family. And these were, of course, photos taken before the Executive Order 9066 was issued in February, when it was issued on February 19th in 1942. Now here, you can see the inside of the restaurant. You can see several of the family members. And when the family actually sold the restaurant, they said, they actually sold the restaurant to, as the family said, a nice Chinese man who they said paid a fair price. And while the family was at the Tanfran Assembly Center, they were given the number 22507. And that was the identification number. That was their identification number. And they also had subsequent tags that were issued to aid in keeping the family together during all phases of the evacuation. The family was given a number, and there was a letter that was appended to it for each family member. So the father was A, the mother was B, and then the children succeeding letters according to their age. Now, the wife, Mrs. Nonaka, Sue Nonaka, she would always say that her number, she would always say that number as if it were ingrained in her. And the Nonakas actually entered the relocation camp in Topaz, Utah on September 17th, 1942. And they were at camp, they were in block 6, barrack 2, apartment E. Now the family now I will tell you, when the family returned to San Francisco, Sue and Eddie, you can see some pictures there with their grandchildren. Sue and Eddie were able to use the proceeds from the sale of the Nisei Grill to put a down payment on a house in San Francisco. I will tell you, the family still has they still have Eddie's tin cup from camp with his assigned number. The family, they sometimes use it as a laundry detergent scoop. Now, you may be wondering how a picture of painted rocks and Dorothea Lange's photo of Nisei Grill inspired this presentation. Well, like many of you during the shelter in place, I'd been walking around my neighborhood for exercise, and I always like to stop by and admire these beautiful painted rocks in one of my neighbor's front yards. Well, I like to see what rocks are new, and I'd been hoping to meet the painter for ages. And one day their dog was in the front room, was in the front window, and he barked and he barked and he barked. And a woman, she popped her head out and apologized. Well, we got to talking and we've texted, and I sent her some articles about stained glass that I'd been researching. And I even invited her to join some of these virtual art programs. And she has actually given me those beautiful rocks you see on the bottom right of the moon and the purple ladybug. So that was when she told me about her connection to the photographer Dorothea Lange and the Oka Museum of California, which is, where I'm a docent. Well, luckily that week I'd been looking over the museum's website at the Dorothea Lange collection. I'd been doing that for a presentation. And so when Jamie, as you can see her name down here, she mentioned that the photo of her family's restaurant, when she mentioned that, I knew exactly the image she had been talking about. What are the chances, right? So we've actually only lived a few blocks away from each other for decades, but we never knew each other. But since the shelter in place, I have to say I changed my walking route, and that's how we met. And she told me more about this photo and about the people, about her grandfather and her great-grandfather. And that's what inspired me to look a little bit more closely at some of the people and some of the stories behind these really famous works that we look at all the time. Well, now that we've had an opportunity to look at these works of art and learn a little bit more about the subject, who they were, not only in the brief moment it took to create the work that made them famous, but also the backstory to the people, things, and events, both famous and not so known. And now you know the rest of the story. All right. Oh, did I make it in time? Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, make.
So thank you, Bernice.
Yay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bernice.
Thank you, Paco.
Yeah, it's been really interesting because we see these paintings and we take these images in, and I don't think we often interrogate ourselves as like who they might have been, what they were like. Maybe we try to imagine that. So it's great that you're able to deliver some of that information and help us speculate on who these models were and what their relationship would have been to the painting that was created. I'd love to hear some other thoughts from folks. Anyone else have a question or a comment about
It's on
Bernice?
Rodney, actually.
Go ahead, Paco.
So that I really like how they look, like a restaurant, like in the Philippines. There's apparently a Japanese restaurant called Nikkei.
Decades?
Yes.
Oh. Now, I will tell you, Nisei is with that the word Nisei is usually for people who whose parents were the immigrants from Japan, and then these would be people who were born in this country from parents who had immigrated from Japan. That's what the word means.
Oh, great to know that, Bernice.
And could I ask, in the Moulin Rouge, I
Yeah.
wasn't quite clear. You said the woman had a disease.
Yes.
It was a disease that allowed her to displace her hip joint or something, or?
Well, she would move. Let me look at my notes here. She would move. So it helped her. I think it's a movement disorder. It's a movement disorder disease, and that was, it sort of, I guess, helped her come up with that sort of style her dancing style, if you will.
Ah, okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
And actually, that photo, it looks like a quail egg too.
Yeah.
It looks like a quail egg.
Yeah.
Oh, you're making me hungry, Paco.
I see that Diane has a question or comment. Go ahead, Diane.
I mean, in the Nisei grill picture,
Yes.
wasn't the little girl in that picture from 1976 the next image after the grill picture?
Yeah, can we go
Wasn't
back
she
to
the-
that?
Yes. This one?
Yes.
Yeah, those are his grandchildren. That's my neighbor. She doesn't look like that anymore, but
Yeah, I think that connection was missed, that one of the little girls is
Oh,
the
I'm
person that
sorry.
painted the rocks.
Yes. So the younger one, the baby sitting on grandpa's lap, is my neighbor. Now, obviously, she doesn't look like this now. I'm just a little older, just a tad, 2 or 3 years older. But yes, that's my neighbor. I'm sorry. Thank you for clarifying, Diane. And can I just tell you, I love grandma and grandpa. This photo of grandma and grandpa, I think grandma looks so glamorous with her, she's got her hair done. I was like, grandma's pretty stylish, I gotta tell you. Grandpa looks stylish too, but I love grandma's hair. She looks so stylish.
Well, and it's a great perspective on a very dark chapter in American history, and to see how resilient some of the victims of that terrible executive order were is I don't know, gives us some hope, I guess.
Right. And you can see grandpa, well, he's not my grandpa, baby. You can see grandpa here, right? In 3 of these different pictures, you can see him as a young man on the left, and you can see grandpa a couple these other places. He looks the same, honestly. Got sort of the same hairline.
He didn't lose much of his hair. Grandma chose well.
I know grandma chose well, yeah. I just think she looks so stylish.
So thanks
can
for that.
appreciate- You keep saying,
No.
you keep saying
Oh,
that grandma looks stylish.
Yeah, good. Wait, let's let Marcia go and then Paco.
You have remarked that grandma looks stylish, and I'm imagining that you have images maybe of your own grandmother that you're mentally comparing to. So help me appreciate even more deeply. She looks stylish because she's in such Western apparel,
I
or
think her hair, right? It looks like she's gotten her hair. I mean, I'd like to think my hair would do that naturally, but no, that would be a lot of product. Let me tell you, right? So she's gotten her hair done. She's got her nice earrings on. I'd like to say I look like that I'd like to tell you I look like that every day as I work from home, but there's not a chance.
Well, it also harkens back to the way people used to get dressed up to travel because they're clearly at the airport.
Yes.
No
And-
more.
Yes. We won't talk about what I look like when I go to the airport. I do not look nearly that fancy.
So I think Paco had a comment, and then Nikki.
That photo intentionally looks ancient, like in the middle too. Like the family is waiting for like the plane to be boarded too.
Yes.
Seems like the colors may have washed out a little bit from that photograph.
From that 1976 photo. Well, I don't know how but I know some of my photos have faded, and I don't think in that we're maybe a little bit more recent than 1976. Absolutely.
Yeah. Thanks, Paco. Go ahead, Nikki.
Oh, I was going to make that comment too about them traveling and how elegant they look because they're traveling. And also, I don't think we're thinking them as much older people, but they've got young grandchildren. They're probably in their 60s, so they're not super seniors in that.
No, they're not. No, absolutely not. And let me tell you, 60 gets a little younger every day, but absolutely.
Thank you. Yes.
Can I ask a question about Jane Avril?
Yes.
In the picture, the one with her kicking her leg, her face looks quite old. I'm sorry, aged. But wasn't she was a young woman in that representation?
Right, so right here, you're looking on the left-hand side, the poster.
Yeah, but she looks like an older
Are you
person.
thinking this one?
No, the one in the red, the poster.
Right, the poster.
Yeah, she looks like she looks like a 20-year-old dancer. She looks older, doesn't she?
Yeah, I mean,
Yes.
sometimes 20 years is a hard 20 years.
Yeah. Maybe it was like Frida.
Also looks kind of bored, like she's done this 1,000 times.
Maybe it's boredom I'm seeing.
And then the source of the can, would it have been her illness that leads to this different dancing style?
About the can in general, I don't.
Yeah. Or she just happened to be well suited to do the can.
I think she choreographed her own dance routines that were very much, I'm sure, a result of what she could do, and also she had this movement disorder. So I'm sure since she choreographed them, I'm sure she did them to sort of showcase her abilities. But in terms of like the history of the can, that I'm afraid I don't know very much about. Sorry.
And may I ask, Madam X, who was drinking arsenic to maintain the pallor of her skin? Oh my! But clearly, she lived a long life. It sounded like.
Yeah, we don't. I just want to say we at Art Viewing Adventures do not recommend taking of arsenic, because there's better ways to do skincare, I think.
Yes, in terms of self-care, skincare, absolutely. We do not suggest that. We do not recommend. We do not endorse. Please don't. But
what did she die from?
Do not try this at home.
Yeah, do not try the arsenic at home. Please don't. Oh my. I don't really know what the actual cause of death was, but she died in obscurity, and she and her husband were separated, and she sort of was not well. She sort of went into hiding, for lack of a better term. After sort of not favorable reviews of the John Singer Sargent painting portrait.
Okay.
But now, of course, it hangs in the Met, and we all look at that, and I know I've looked at that, and I've always thought, oh, I'd love to be, that tall, svelte, and glamorous. But at the time, it was scandalous.
And you're saying can didn't start till the 30s? I just read that in the chat. So this couldn't be can?
I don't see how that could be. Is that true? I don't know.
I apologize. I don't know very much about the history of the can dancing.
Me neither.
I'll mention the Grant Wood discussion kind of resonated with Sarah and I, because we got to see American Gothic in Chicago.
Okay.
There's a really very energetic museum guard who yells at people about every 30 seconds to get away from it. They get way too close to it. But we enjoyed seeing a lot of other Grant Wood on our trip, because we did go to as I said, the Cedar Rapids Museum, and also in Des Moines. Des Moines has an excellent art museum, as I think Bernice.
Yes, been out there a couple times. Absolutely. I think I've seen, and actually I took a virtual presentation of that. So very interesting, right? There is art in some of these smaller places that are pretty wonderful.
I see Peter and Kevin, hands up.
We actually saw a wonderful Grant Wood exhibit at the Whitney a few years ago. It was pretty extensive. And well, that museum has had fantastic exhibits every time we've gone to them. The other thing is the can did start in the 1830s in Paris dance halls.
Oh.
So it is from the 30s, just not the 1930s.
The 30s. All right. Well, we should probably wrap up because we have another program coming up at 2:15. So, Bernice, I want to thank you once again for coming on the show and an excellent presentation. We will be back in 2 weeks and we'll be talking about, I think Bernice, I'm sorry, I think we just put it in the chat, but we will be talking about Yerba Buena Center for the Arts and the wonderful sculpture that's available at the Yerba Buena Gardens. And also, I think tonight's program with Richie Unterberger will be, as always, a great presentation. So thanks everyone for tuning in.
Richie,
Yeah, we'll probably see you there, Paco. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and
I need to go.
everyone stay good.